original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Clara Whitmore stands alone in the rain-soaked courtyard of Ashcombe House, her fingers trembling as she clutches the iron handle of her restoration case. Water drips from the brim of her bonnet. Her eyes lift toward the towering stone facade, where candlelight flickers behind tall windows. A man watches from the uppermost balcony, his silhouette unmoving against the gray October sky. She does not see him yet. Inside the vestibule, a young maid whispers to the butler, her voice barely audible above the hiss of rain. The butler's reply is calm, certain, and impossible. Clara takes one step forward, then another, unaware that the man above has been waiting for this moment longer than she has been traveling toward it. The carriage had lurched to a halt just after 3 in the afternoon. Clara had felt the wheels sink slightly into the gravel drive before the footman opened the door and extended his gloved hand. She had taken it without looking at his face. Her attention had already moved beyond him to the house itself. Ashcombe House rose from the earth like something carved from memory rather than stone. Its gray walls were softened by centuries of rain and wind. Ivy clung to the western wing. The windows were tall and narrow, their panes reflecting the pale autumn sky in fragmented pieces. It was not the largest estate Clara had ever visited, but it carried a weight that size alone could not account for. There was gravity here, history, consequence. She stepped down onto the gravel and straightened her shoulders. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Clara adjusted the strap of her leather case and walked toward the entrance with measured steps. She had learned long ago not to hurry. Haste suggested eagerness, and eagerness invited questions she had no desire to answer. The vestibule was dim and cool. A fire burned low in the hearth to the left, its light barely reaching the high ceiling. The floor was polished marble, veined with gray and gold. A long table stood against the far wall, topped with a vase of late-season roses that had begun to droop. Clara set down her case and removed her gloves, folding them carefully before tucking them into her coat pocket. A young maid appeared from a side corridor, her cap slightly askew. She carried a tray of empty teacups and paused when she saw Clara. Her eyes widened briefly before she composed herself and offered a quick curtsy. Clara nodded in return, but said nothing. She had grown accustomed to that look. It was not quite recognition, but something close to it, a flicker of uncertainty, a question forming but not yet spoken. The butler emerged a moment later. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face that revealed nothing. His posture was impeccable. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades managing the invisible machinery of a great house. He stopped a few paces from Clara and inclined his head. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and even. "We have been expecting you." "Thank you," Clara replied. She kept her tone polite, but distant. "I trust the materials I requested have arrived." "They have. Everything is prepared in the library, as you specified." Clara nodded. She glanced toward the staircase that curved upward into shadow. The banister was dark wood, polished to a soft gleam. Above, she could just make out the edge of a portrait frame and the corner of a tapestry. Behind her, the young maid whispered to the butler. Clara did not turn, but she heard the words clearly enough. "How long has the Duke loved her?" There was a pause. The butler's reply came softly, but with a certainty that seemed to fill the entire vestibule. "Since before she arrived." Clara's breath caught. She did not move. She kept her gaze fixed on the staircase, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her case. The words made no sense. They were impossible, and yet they hung in the air with the weight of truth. She did not see the man at the top of the stairs, but he was there, watching, waiting. His hands rested lightly on the banister, his expression unreadable in the half-light. He did not move. He simply stood, as though he had been standing there for years, and would continue to stand there until she looked up and met his gaze. But Clara did not look up. She turned instead to the butler and spoke in a voice that betrayed nothing. "I would like to begin my work as soon as possible. Of course, Miss Whitmore. I will show you to the library." She followed him down a corridor, lined with portraits. The faces in the frames watched her pass with painted eyes. Clara kept her own gaze forward. She had no interest in the dead. She had come here for the work. Only the work. But as she walked, she felt the weight of something she could not name. It pressed against her shoulders, like a hand. It whispered at the edges of her thoughts, and though she did not yet know it, the man at the top of the stairs had already begun to descend. Clara Whitmore had not always carried her name like a burden. There had been a time years ago when it had meant something different. Security, respectability, a modest but honest place in the world. Her father had been a merchant of good standing, known for his fairness and his careful management of accounts. The Whitmore name had opened doors. It had secured invitations. It had promised a future. That future had ended on a cold morning in March, 11 years earlier. Clara had been 21. She had been sitting in the parlor of their home, in the market town of Halford, embroidering a cushion cover she had no real desire to finish. Her mother had been upstairs, resting. Her father had been in his study, as he always was in the mornings, reviewing ledgers and correspondence. The knock at the door had been sharp, insistent. Clara had set down her needle and gone to answer it herself, since the housekeeper had been occupied in the kitchen. 2 men had stood on the threshold. One had been a solicitor she recognized vaguely from church. The other had been a stranger, tall and thin, with a face like a blade. They had asked to speak with her father. Clara had shown them to the study and closed the door behind them. She had returned to the parlor and picked up her embroidery, but she had not been able to focus. The voices from the study had been low at first, then louder. She had heard her father's voice rise in protest. She had heard the word Blackthorn spoken more than once. When the men had left, her father had remained in the study. Clara had knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. He had been sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. The ledgers lay open before him. His shoulders had been shaking. "Father?" He had looked up. His face had been pale. His eyes had been red. "We are ruined, Clara." The words had been simple, final, and true. The details had come slowly, over the course of days and weeks. Her father had invested heavily in a venture tied to the Blackthorn estate. He had been assured of returns. He had been given guarantees. But the venture had collapsed. The guarantees had proven worthless. The Blackthorn family, protected by title and wealth, had walked away unscathed. Her father had not. Within 6 months, the house had been sold. The furnishings had been auctioned. Her mother, already frail, had taken ill and never recovered. Clara had buried her in the churchyard at Halford on a gray afternoon in November. Her father had followed 2 years later, his spirit broken long before his body gave out. Clara had been left with nothing but her name and a small inheritance that barely covered her debts. She had taken lodgings in a boarding house in the city and begun to rebuild her life with the only skill she possessed, a steady hand and an eye for detail. She had apprenticed herself to a manuscript restorer, an elderly man named Mr. Godfrey, who had seen something in her quiet determination. She had learned the craft slowly, carefully, with the same discipline she had once applied to embroidery and household management. She had discovered that she had a gift for it. Her fingers were nimble. Her patience was endless. She could coax faded ink back to legibility. She could mend torn pages so seamlessly that the repair was nearly invisible. Word of her skill had spread. Commissions had begun to arrive, small at first, then larger. Libraries, private collectors, universities. She had built a reputation. She had earned enough to leave the boarding house and take a small flat of her own. She had learned to live alone, to ask for nothing, to expect nothing. She had never sought justice. She had never demanded restitution. She had simply endured. And in enduring, she had found a kind of peace. It was not happiness, but it was enough. Until the letter had arrived from Ashcombe House. The commission had been straightforward. A collection of water-damaged account books from the late 18th century. The work would take several weeks. The payment offered had been generous, almost too generous. Clara had hesitated before accepting, but the work was legitimate. The terms were clear, and she had no reason to refuse. She had not known, when she packed her case and boarded the coach, that the name Ashcombe House belonged to the Duke of Blackthorn. She had not known that the man who had written the letter had known her name long before she had known his. She had not known that she had been watched from a distance for years. But he had known, and he had waited. The library at Ashcombe House was a room of breathtaking stillness. It occupied the entire southern wing of the second floor, with windows that overlooked the gardens and the distant line of hills beyond. The shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes bound in leather and cloth, their spines faded by time and sunlight. The air smelled of old paper and beeswax. A long table stood in the center of the room, its surface cleared except for a single stack of ledgers and a lamp with a green glass shade. Clara set down her case and removed her coat. She draped it over the back of a chair and rolled up her sleeves. The ledgers were exactly as described in the letter. Water-stained, fragile. The ink had bled in places, rendering whole passages illegible. But the damage was not irreparable. She had seen worse. She opened her case and laid out her tools with practiced precision. A set of fine brushes, bottles of distilled water and fixative, sheets of blotting paper, a magnifying glass, a small jar of powdered gum arabic. She worked methodically, her movements calm and deliberate. This was the part of her work she loved most. The moment before beginning, the quiet assessment, the promise of restoration. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the footsteps on the carpet. She only became aware of his presence when he spoke. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He stood just inside the doorway, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He was tall, perhaps 35, with dark hair that fell just past his collar. His eyes were gray, the color of rain. His face was lean and angular, marked by a faint scar along his left jaw. He wore no coat, only a waistcoat and shirt sleeves. He looked as though he had been working, though at what she could not guess. Clara straightened. She wiped her hands on a cloth and inclined her head. "Your Grace." He stepped forward. His gaze moved briefly to the table, to the ledgers, then back to her. "I trust you have everything you need." "I do, thank you," he nodded. There was a pause. He seemed to be searching for something to say, but the words did not come easily. Clara waited. She had learned to be patient with silence. "I have admired your work for some time," he said at last. His voice was low, careful. "The restoration you completed for the Radcliffe Library was exceptional." Clara blinked. She had not expected that. The Radcliffe Commission had been 3 years ago. It had been one of her most challenging projects, a collection of medieval manuscripts damaged by fire. She had spent months on it. But she had not imagined that anyone outside the library's trustees had paid attention. "You are familiar with that project?" she asked. "I am." He took another step closer. His gaze was steady, almost unsettling in its intensity. "I have followed your career with interest." Clara felt a flicker of unease. She kept her expression neutral. "That is kind of you to say, Your Grace." "It is not kindness, it is fact." Another pause. Clara turned back to the table and picked up one of the ledgers, more to occupy her hands than out of necessity. "These books are in poor condition," she said, "but I believe I can recover most of the text. It will take time. Take as much time as you need." She glanced at him. There was something in his tone that she could not quite identify. Not impatience, not indifference, something closer to longing. "Is there a particular reason you wish these ledgers restored?" she asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "Yes, but I would prefer to explain that later, if you will allow it." Clara nodded slowly. She did not press. She had learned not to ask questions she was not certain she wanted answered. "Very well." He inclined his head and turned to leave. But at the door, he paused. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, I am glad you are here." He did not wait for her reply. He left the room and closed the door softly behind him. Clara stood alone in the library, the ledger still in her hands. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She set the book down and took a slow breath. She did not know what to make of him. His formality, his intensity, the way he had looked at her, as though she were not a stranger, but someone he had known for years. She returned to her work. She opened the first ledger and began to examine the pages with her magnifying glass. The ink was faded but still legible in places. She made notes in her journal, documenting the extent of the damage and the steps she would need to take. But as she worked, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by him, he was gone, but by something else, by the house itself, by the past it contained, by the name that had brought her here. She did not yet know that the man who had just left the room had spent years preparing for this moment, that he had known her name before she had ever set foot in Ashcombe House, that he had followed her work, not out of idle curiosity, but out of something far more deliberate. She did not yet know that his love for her had begun long before she arrived, but she would learn, in time, and when she did, everything would change. Clara worked in silence for the next 3 days. She arrived in the library each morning, just after 8, and did not leave until the light began to fail. The butler brought her tea at regular intervals. The young maid occasionally appeared to stoke the fire or replace the candles, but otherwise she was left alone. The work was painstaking. Each page had to be carefully separated, dried, and treated with fixative to prevent further deterioration. The ink had to be tested to determine its composition before any attempt at restoration could be made. Some passages were beyond recovery. Others could be coaxed back to legibility with patience and the right combination of water and solvent. Clara lost herself in the rhythm of it. The careful brush strokes, the slow revelation of words that had been hidden for decades. It was the kind of work that required absolute focus, and she welcomed it. It kept her mind occupied. It kept her from thinking too much about the man who had stood in the doorway and told her he had followed her career with interest. She had seen him only once since that first encounter. He had passed through the library on the second afternoon, nodded to her briefly, and left without speaking. She had been relieved. She did not know what to say to him. She did not know how to interpret his attention. But on the 4th day, as she was examining a particularly damaged page, she noticed something that made her pause. It was a notation in the margin of one of the ledgers. A small, neat script that differed from the main entries. It referenced a payment made in the spring of 1809 to a merchant in Halford. The name of the merchant was partially obscured by water damage, but Clara could make out enough of it to recognize it. Whitmore. Her breath stilled. She set down her brush and leaned closer, her heart beginning to pound. She traced the faint letters with her fingertip. There was no mistake. It was her family name. She turned the page carefully. There were more entries, payments, investments, agreements, and then, near the bottom of the page, a notation that made her stomach tighten. Investment collapsed. Liability transferred to merchant. No further action required. Clara sat back. Her hands were trembling. She stared at the page, her mind racing. This was it. This was the record of the transaction that had ruined her father, the investment that had been guaranteed, the liability that had been transferred, the decision that had destroyed her family. And it was here, in the ledgers she had been hired to restore. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She crossed to the window and pressed her palms against the cool glass. Outside, the garden stretched away toward the hills. The sky was overcast, the light pale and diffuse. She could see a figure walking along one of the gravel paths, a man in a dark coat. She could not see his face, but she knew who it was. She turned back to the table. The ledger lay open, the damning words still visible. She felt a surge of anger, sharp and sudden. She had been brought here to restore these records, to preserve them, to make them legible again. But why? She gathered her tools and left the library. She walked quickly down the corridor, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she needed answers. She found the butler in the entrance hall, overseeing the arrangement of a new delivery of flowers. "Where is the Duke?" she asked. The butler turned, his expression as calm as ever. "His Grace is in the East Garden, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you." She did not wait for a reply. She went to the side door and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the garden. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing beside a stone fountain, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the water. "Your Grace," he turned. His expression shifted when he saw her face. He straightened. "Miss Whitmore, is something wrong?" She stopped a few paces away. She kept her voice steady, though it cost her. "I found something in the ledgers." He did not reply. He simply waited. A record of a transaction, an investment, made with a merchant in Halford, a man named Whitmore. His face went very still. He did not look away. "Yes," he said quietly. "You knew." "I knew." Clara felt the anger rise again, hotter this time. You brought me here to restore the very records that document my family's ruin. Why? He took a step toward her. His voice was low, but there was no defensiveness in it, only a kind of weary honesty. Because I wanted you to see the truth, not as a rumor, not as a story told secondhand, but as fact, recorded, undeniable. Why would I want to see that? Because I wanted you to know that I have seen it too, that I have carried it, that I have not forgotten. Clara stared at him. She did not understand. She shook her head. I don't know what you mean. He exhaled slowly. He looked away, toward the fountain, then back at her. There is more in those ledgers than you have found yet. Keep reading. And when you are ready, I will tell you the rest. He turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Clara stood alone in the garden, the wind stirring her skirts. She watched him go, her heart pounding, her thoughts a tangle of confusion and anger, and something she could not yet name. She returned to the library. She sat down at the table and opened the next ledger, and she began to read. The pattern emerged slowly. At first, Clara thought it was coincidence, a series of unrelated transactions scattered across the years. But as she worked through the ledgers, page by page, she began to see the connections. Payments made to a restoration firm in the city, commissions for manuscript work, anonymous purchases of rare books and documents that had later been donated to libraries and universities, and in the margins, in that same neat script, notations that referenced her name. Not Whitmore, Clara. She found the first reference on the 6th day, a payment made to a restoration firm in 1848. The notation read, "For the attention of Miss C. Whitmore, Radcliffe Collection." Her hands stilled. She turned the page. There was another entry, and another. Commissions she had completed over the past 5 years. Work she had believed she had earned on her own merit. But here, in these ledgers, was evidence that the work had been arranged, funded, directed, by him. She sat back, her mind reeling. She thought of the lean years, the months when commissions had been scarce, and she had wondered if she would be able to pay her rent. And then, just when she had begun to despair, a letter would arrive, a new project, a generous fee. She had thought it was luck, persistence, the slow accumulation of reputation. But it had not been luck. It had been him. She stood and left the library. She did not knock when she reached his study. She pushed open the door and found him at his desk, writing. He looked up, startled, then rose to his feet. "Miss Whitmore, you have been managing my career," she said. Her voice was cold, controlled. 4 years, without my knowledge, without my consent. He did not deny it. He simply stood there, his expression grave. "Yes. Why?" He came around the desk. He stopped a few paces from her, his hands at his sides. "Because I owed you. Because my family owed you. And because I could not bear to see you struggle when I had the means to help." "Help?" Clara's voice rose. "You call this help? You manipulated my livelihood. You made me dependent on your charity without my knowing it. Do you have any idea what that feels like? I did not want you to feel indebted. I am indebted. I have been indebted for years without knowing it. Every commission I completed, every success I thought I had earned, it was all a lie." No, his voice was firm. "The work was yours. The skill was yours. I only ensured that the opportunities reached you. I did not restore those manuscripts. You did." Clara shook her head. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You had no right." "I know. Then why?" He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was open, unguarded, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Because I knew your name before I knew your face. Because I knew what my father had done to yours. And because I could not undo that harm. But I could try to repair it, in the only way I knew how." Clara felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by something heavier. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands gripping the armrests. "Your father," she said slowly. "He was responsible for the investment, for the collapse. Yes, I discovered it years after his death. I was going through his papers, settling the estate. I found correspondence, agreements, evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. He had known the venture would fail. But he had allowed your father to invest anyway, because it protected his own interests." Clara closed her eyes. She had known, in some abstract way, that the Blackthorne family had been involved. But hearing it spoken aloud, with such certainty, made it real in a way it had never been before. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I did not know how. Because I was ashamed. And because I thought that if I could help you quietly, without drawing attention to the past, it would be enough. It is not enough, I know." She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was still standing, his posture rigid, his face lined with something that looked like grief. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing. I only wanted you to know the truth, and to decide for yourself what that truth means." Clara stood. She felt exhausted, hollowed out. She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. "I need time," she said. "Take as much as you need." She left the study and returned to her room. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the light was fading. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, Clara Whitmore allowed herself to weep. The estate council convened on a cold morning in late October. The meeting was held in the great hall, a room of dark wood and high ceilings that had witnessed centuries of decisions, both momentous and mundane. The councillors sat around a long table, their faces grave and watchful. They were men of property and influence, bound to the Blackthorn estate by ties of land and loyalty. Clara had not been invited, but she had been asked to remain available, in case the council wished to consult her regarding the ledgers. She waited in the library, her hands idle, her thoughts restless. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the hall below. She could not make out the words, but she could sense the tension. The Duke had told her, the night before, that he intended to address the council. He had not told her what he planned to say, but she had seen the resolve in his eyes, and she had known that whatever he intended, it would not be easy. The murmur of voices grew louder. Then, abruptly, there was silence. Clara stood and moved to the door, opening it just enough to hear. The Duke's voice carried clearly through the hall. It was calm, steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Gentlemen, I have asked you here to address a matter that has weighed on this estate for too long. A matter of debt, of responsibility, of honor." There was a pause. Clara heard the scrape of a chair, a cough. "The ledgers that have been under restoration reveal a pattern of transactions that reflect poorly on this house. Specifically, an investment made in 1809 with a merchant named Whitmore. That investment was misrepresented. The merchant was led to believe that the venture was sound. It was not. When it collapsed, the liability was transferred entirely to him. He was ruined. His family was destroyed, and this house bore no consequence." Another pause. Clara's heart was pounding. That merchant was the father of Miss Clara Whitmore, the restorer currently employed by this estate. She has worked for years to rebuild what was taken from her, and she has done so without knowledge of the full extent of this house's culpability. Until now. A voice interrupted. Clara recognized it as belonging to Mr. Thornley, the estate's senior administrator. "Your Grace, with respect, that transaction was conducted under your father's stewardship. It is a matter of historical record, but it does not reflect on your tenure. There is no legal obligation. I am not speaking of legal obligation, Mr. Thornley. I am speaking of moral responsibility. The debt may be historical, but the harm is ongoing, and it is this house that bears it. Therefore, it is I who bear it." Silence. Clara pressed her hand to the doorframe, her breath shallow. The Duke continued, his voice unwavering. "I am proposing that we establish a formal restitution, a sum equal to what was lost, adjusted for the passage of time, to be paid to Miss Whitmore, as acknowledgement of the harm done to her family." The hall erupted. Voices rose in protest. Clara heard Mr. Thornley's voice above the others. "Your Grace, this is unprecedented. It sets a dangerous precedent. If we acknowledge liability for every historical transaction, we are not acknowledging liability for every transaction. We are acknowledging liability for this one, because it is documented, because it is clear, and because it is right." Another voice, younger, more cautious. "And what of your reputation, Your Grace? If word of this spreads, let it spread. I would rather be known as a man who faced the truth than as one who hid from it." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She had not expected this. She had not imagined that he would go so far, that he would risk so much. When the Duke spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less firm. The responsibility rests with this house, and therefore with me. I will not turn away from it." Clara closed the door softly. She returned to the table and sat down, her hands trembling. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know what the council would decide. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that the man who had just spoken was not acting out of guilt alone. He was acting out of love. The days that followed were strange and uncertain. The council had adjourned without reaching a decision. Mr. Thornley had requested time to consult with the estate's solicitors. The other councillors had dispersed, their expressions ranging from disapproval to quiet admiration. The Duke had retreated to his study and had not emerged. Clara continued her work in the library, but her focus was fractured. She found herself staring at the ledgers without seeing them. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the scene in the great hall, around his words, around the choice he had made. Rumors began to spread through the household. The servants whispered in the corridors. The young maid who had asked the butler about the Duke's affections now looked at Clara with something like awe. The butler himself remained impassive, but Clara thought she detected a faint warmth in his gaze when he brought her tea. She did not see the Duke for 3 days. She did not seek him out. She did not know what she would say if she did. But on the 4th day, she found a letter slipped beneath her door. It was written in his hand, the script neat and precise. "Miss Whitmore, I do not expect your forgiveness. I do not expect your gratitude. I only ask that you consider, when this is finished, whether you might allow me the privilege of knowing you, not as a debt to be repaid, not as a responsibility to be managed, but as a person, as yourself. I have loved you since before you arrived, not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as the woman whose work I have admired, whose resilience I have witnessed, and whose dignity I have come to revere. If you cannot accept that love, I will understand, but I wanted you to know that it exists, and that it is offered freely, with no expectation of return. Yours, A.B. Clara read the letter 3 times. She folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her dress. She stood at the window and looked out at the gardens. The leaves had turned gold and red. The light was low and slanting. Autumn was deepening into winter. She thought of her father, of her mother, of the years she had spent rebuilding her life from the ruins they had left behind. She thought of the commissions she had believed she had earned, and the truth that had shattered that belief. She thought of the man who had orchestrated it all, not out of pity, but out of a sense of responsibility, so deep it had shaped the course of his life. And she thought of the question the maid had asked. How long has the Duke loved her? Since before she arrived. She did not know if she could love him in return. She did not know if she could forgive what had been done, even in the name of restitution. But she knew that she wanted to try, that she wanted to know him, not as the Duke of Blackthorn, not as the son of the man who had ruined her father, but as the man who had stood before his council and claimed responsibility for a debt that was not his own. She left the library and went in search of him. She found him on the terrace. It was late in the evening, and the wind had risen. The curtains in the open doorway billowed and snapped. The lamp on the stone table beside him had been extinguished by the gusts. He stood with his hands braced on the balustrade, looking out over the cliffs toward the sea. The sky was dark, streaked with the last remnants of sunset. He did not turn when she approached, but she knew he had heard her. "Your Grace," she said. He turned then. His face was shadowed, but she could see the tension in his posture, the weariness in his eyes. "Miss Whitmore." She stepped closer. The wind pulled at her skirts and loosened strands of her hair. She did not try to smooth them back. "I read your letter," she said. He nodded. He did not speak. "I do not know if I can forgive what was done," she continued. Her voice was steady, though her heart was not. "I do not know if I can accept what you have given me, knowing that it was shaped by guilt as much as by care. I understand, but I want to try." He straightened. His expression shifted, something like hope flickering across his features. "You do?" "Yes," she took a breath. "I want to know you. Not as the man who managed my life from a distance, not as the Duke who bears the weight of his father's sins, but as the man who stood before his council and claimed responsibility for a harm he did not commit. That took courage, and I want to understand where that courage comes from." He stepped toward her. The wind roared around them, but his voice cut through it, clear and certain. "It comes from you." Clara blinked. "From me?" "Yes. From knowing that you endured what I could not have endured. From watching you rebuild what was taken from you, with no help and no complaint. From seeing you work with such care and precision, restoring what others had damaged. You gave me a model for what it means to repair the past, and I wanted to be worthy of that." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She shook her head, but she was smiling. "You do not need to be worthy of me. You only need to be honest. Then I will be honest." He stepped closer still, until they were only a breath apart. "I love you. I have loved you since I first learned your name and understood what it meant. I have loved you through every commission I arranged, every letter I wrote, every moment I waited for you to arrive, and I will love you still, whether you accept it or not." Clara reached up and placed her hand on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and strong. "Then let it be known," she said, "without secrecy, without shame. I will not be loved in silence. I will not be repaired in the dark. If you love me, let it be seen." He covered her hand with his own. His eyes searched hers. "And if the world judges us for it, then let them judge. I have endured worse." He smiled then, a slow, wondering smile that transformed his face. And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was firm and deliberate, full of years of waiting and wanting. Clara kissed him back with equal force, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. The wind roared around them, tearing at their clothes and their hair. The lamp clattered off the table and rolled across the terrace. Neither of them noticed. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Clara rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close. "I am afraid," she whispered. "So am I, but I want this. So do I." They stood together on the windswept terrace, the night closing in around them, and for the first time in years, Clara Whitmore felt something she had thought she had lost forever: hope. The resolution came slowly. The council, after much deliberation, agreed to the Duke's proposal. A sum was established. Papers were drawn up. Clara signed them with a steady hand, though the act felt surreal. She had not sought restitution. She had not demanded it. But it was offered, and she accepted it, not because she needed the money, but because it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of harm, a step toward repair. The Duke's reputation became uncertain. Some in society applauded his integrity. Others whispered that he had been reckless, that he had set a dangerous precedent, that he had allowed sentiment to override prudence. He bore it all with quiet dignity, neither defending himself nor retreating. Clara remained at Ashcombe House. She completed the restoration of the ledgers, and when she was finished, the Duke asked her to stay, not as an employee, not as a guest, but as a partner. Together, they made a decision. They would open the estate's historical records to public audit. They would allow scholars and historians to examine the ledgers, to document the transactions, to tell the truth of what had been done. It was a risk. It would expose the estate to scrutiny. It would invite criticism. But it was honest, and honesty, they had learned, was worth the cost. The household adjusted. The young maid no longer whispered. She recorded Clara's name in the guest book with visible respect. The butler observed with quiet approval. The other servants, initially wary, came to accept Clara's presence. She was not the Duke's mistress. She was not his charity case. She was his equal. The final image that would remain in the minds of all who witnessed it came on a cold December morning. Clara and the Duke stood together in the library, side by side at the long table. Before them lay the first of the newly restored ledgers, its pages clean and legible, its history preserved. The Duke dipped a pen in ink and signed his name on the first page. Then he handed the pen to Clara. She signed her name beside his. Not Whitmore alone, but Clara Whitmore, in full, without hesitation. They looked at each other, and in that look was everything they had endured, everything they had chosen, everything they would build together. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. The gardens turned white. The cliffs disappeared into mist. But inside the library, the fire burned warm and bright. The love that had begun before her arrival now began again, in full light, with nothing hidden, with everything to lose, and everything to gain.